If you grew up hearing that prayer is asking, insisting, and waiting, perhaps something here will make you uncomfortable, and that's a good sign. Because before every miracle, before the resurrection of Lazarus, before the impossible happened, Jesus did not do what we were taught to do. He didn't beg, he didn't negotiate with God, he didn't repeat words hoping to be heard. He followed a method, an inner path, a spiritual practice that has been left out of most pulpits. Maybe that's why your prayers sometimes seem empty, mechanical, as if something essential is missing. And no, this is not a lack of faith. It's memory. A silent reminder that Jesus' prayer was not noise, it was alignment. It wasn't speech, it was presence. And when he spoke, the power was already in motion, because something profound had already happened before, out of sight, in the silence. Before we continue, write here in the comments where you are watching. I want to know how far this message is reaching, because what we are going to talk about today crosses cultures, religions, and structures. It's not about the institution. It's about practice. It's about what Jesus did when no one was looking. What was hidden was not a verse, nor a magic word. It was a simple yet transformative spiritual technique. A way to enter the inner room, silence the external world, and access the presence of God within oneself. And when you understand this, everything changes. The way of praying, of believing, of living. Because the miracle doesn't start outside. It begins in the silence before the miracle. When you read the resurrection of Lazarus carefully, something immediately catches your attention. Jesus does not behave like someone who is asking heaven for a favor. He doesn't beg, he doesn't negotiate, he doesn't try to convince the Father to change his mind. There is an almost disconcerting calm in his attitude, as if he already knew exactly what was going to happen before he even opened his mouth. This directly clashes with the model of prayer most of us learned in church, based on supplication, emotional effort, and uncertain expectation. Jesus' prayer at that moment is not born of human despair, but of a very specific, deep, and silent inner state. He does not react to the death of Lazarus. He responds from an already established spiritual alignment. While everyone around us cries, shakes, and despairs, Jesus does something simple and powerful. He stops. And that pause, that silence before the miracle, reveals where he is inside. What we were taught over the years was to pray from lack of health, of answers, of solutions, of faith. Jesus does exactly the opposite. He prays from the presence of God within, from a state of union with the Father who was already alive within him even before the situation arose. That's why your words don't try to create a new reality. They just confirm what was already aligned in the invisible. When we begin to see this, we realize that the problem was never God not hearing our prayers. The problem was that we learned a practice that was disconnected from Jesus' secret method. The prayer that precedes the resurrection of Lazarus is not external, it is not emotional, it is not performative. It is interior, silent, and precise. And this difference changes everything, because it points to a spiritual technique that almost no one teaches, but which has always been there, hidden in plain sight. What happened over time was not a complete erasure of Jesus' spiritual method. It was something more subtle and, therefore, more effective. It was removed from practice, not from the text. The words remained in the Gospels, the stories were preserved, the miracles continued to be read and repeated, but Jesus' spiritual technique, how he did it, was no longer taught directly. This creates the feeling that something is missing, even when everything seems to be there. It's like having a recipe without the preparation method. You read the ingredients, understand the objective, but the result never comes out the same. Jesus' secret method was not destroyed because it did not need to be. It was enough not to explain it. It was enough to transform a living practice into metaphor, into poetry, into something beautiful to hear, but impossible to apply. Over time, inner prayer gave way to external formulas, spiritual silence was replaced by repetition of words, and spiritual alignment became just an abstract concept. Still, the method never truly ceased to exist, because it is not stored in institutions, but in human consciousness itself. It remains accessible to anyone willing to go beyond ego, beyond asking, beyond faith as hope, and rediscover original spiritual practice. That's why we say it was removed, not lost. The path is still there, waiting to be remembered, waiting for someone to realize that the spiritual power that Jesus demonstrated did not come from an exclusive privilege, but from an inner technique that can be relearned. If at any point in your life you have ever felt that your prayers were empty, mechanical, or lifeless, this does not mean that you have lost faith. It means exactly the opposite. It means something in you remembers. There is a deep memory, prior to words, that recognizes when practice is disconnected from the source. Modern prayer often happens from mouth to mouth, from thought to nothing, without consciousness really coming into contact with the presence of God within. And the spiritual body realizes this. He feels when prayer became a habit, when it became speech, when it became repetition without alignment. This silent discomfort is not spiritual rebellion, it is a calling. It is the consciousness beyond the ego realizing that Jesus' prayer didn't work like that. He didn't speak to fill the silence. He entered the silence so that something true could emerge. That's why so many people pray, fast, read, attend rituals, and still feel that something essential is missing. Emptiness is not the absence of God, it is the absence of the method. It is the sign that the original spiritual practice has been replaced by an external form that does not access spiritual power. When you begin to understand this, frustration gives way to curiosity, and guilt turns to Christian spiritual awakening. Something inside you begins to remember that inner prayer has always been less about words and more about presence, less about asking and more about returning to the place where the kingdom of God within is already active. There is a decisive point that completely changes the way we understand Jesus' prayer. He did not ask for something to happen. He put himself in the place where it could already happen. While most people pray out of desire, lack, or urgency, Jesus entered a state of spiritual alignment where there was no separation between him and the Father. In this state, prayer without asking stops seeming strange and starts to make sense, because there is no longer any distance to overcome. He didn't try to move God towards him, he moved into the presence of God within. And that's exactly why his words had authority. It wasn't willpower, nor faith as hope, it was faith as method. When Jesus spoke, he spoke from a state of union with the Father, not from the human ego trying to solve a problem. This changes everything, because it reveals that spiritual power does not respond to despair, but to coherence. The more aligned the consciousness, the fewer words are needed. Jesus didn't need to insist because he wasn't outside trying to get in. He was already inside. And when you begin to realize this, you understand that true prayer does not begin with pretty phrases, but with a realignment of your own Christ consciousness. It is at this point that original spiritual practice differs from performative spirituality. One seeks to convince, the other simply becomes available. And when there is alignment, the action flows naturally, without effort, without tension, without doubt. There is a huge difference between talking to God and entering where God is, and almost no one realizes this because we have been trained to confuse thought with presence. Talking to God, the way most people have learned, happens in the mind, in words, in an attempt to make contact with something that seems distant. Entering where God is requires another posture: silence, collection, and willingness to cut through the internal noise. Jesus did not elaborate on spiritual discourses. He entered the inner room, that space of consciousness where the presence of God within is already a reality. In this place, there is no effort, no separation, no feeling of abandonment. There is alignment. This is why thinking about God is not the same as experiencing God. Thinking still maintains distance, while entering dissolves distance. Inner prayer begins when you stop talking and start noticing. It is at this point that spiritual silence stops being empty and becomes a portal. When you understand this, you begin to notice why so many prayers seem to never leave the ceiling. They never left the mind. Jesus crossed that limit, closed the inner door, and operated from a state of union with the Father. And here I really ask you, have you ever felt that there is something deeper than what you have always been taught about prayer? If this made sense to you, write here in the comments what has stood out to you the most so far, and subscribe to the channel, because this conversation is just beginning, and what comes next delves even deeper into this path that was hidden but never ceased to exist. When you look carefully at the Gospels, without rushing and without the lens of religious custom, a pattern begins to appear almost obviously. Before any miracle, before the manifestation of spiritual power, Jesus always withdraws, remains silent, and collects himself. He moves away from the crowd, climbs the mountain, enters into solitude, or simply stops inside, even though he is surrounded by people. This is not coincidence or narrative detail, it is method. The silence before the miracle was not an interval, it was the essential preparation. Jesus understood that the external world only responds when the internal world is aligned. Therefore, there is no rush, there is no anxiety, there is no attempt to prove anything. There is presence, there is focus, there is inner coherence. The hidden pattern is not in the final gesture, but in the state before the gesture. When spiritual alignment happens, action becomes inevitable, almost natural. And it is precisely this standard that has been diluted over time, because it cannot be institutionalized or taught as an external rule. It demands awareness beyond the ego, it demands practice, it demands a willingness to enter the inner room again and again, until the silence stops being uncomfortable and becomes familiar. When you begin to notice this pattern in the texts, something changes in the way you read the miracles. They stop seeming like isolated supernatural events and start to reveal an original spiritual practice that always precedes power. At the tomb of Lazarus, Jesus does something that goes unnoticed by most people, but which reveals with absolute clarity the state of consciousness in which he was. Before any external sign, before the stone is removed, before the dead person leaves, Jesus thanks the Father as if everything had already happened. He says that the Father has already heard him, using the past tense, and this completely dismantles the idea of prayer as a request. No one is grateful for something that hasn't happened yet, unless they are already experiencing it on another level of reality. This detail shows that Jesus was not speaking from the future, but from a point where the outcome was already a fact. This is the direct effect of deep spiritual alignment, where time stops working in the ordinary way. When consciousness enters into union with the Father, the separation between what is and what will be begins to dissolve. Thank you was not a gesture of blind faith, it was recognition. Jesus did not wait for the miracle to trust, he trusted because he was already aligned with the source of spiritual power. This shows us that true inner prayer does not try to provoke something new, it only confirms what has already been established in the invisible. When you understand this, you begin to realize that gratitude in the past tense is not optimism, it is a spiritual position. It is speaking from the presence of God within, and not from human anxiety. This small detail in the text reveals a silent but extremely powerful spiritual technique that completely transforms the way we understand prayer and action. When Jesus gives thanks before the miracle happens, he reveals something even deeper than faith. He shows that he was operating from a state where time no longer rules. In true spiritual alignment, past, present, and future cease to be separate compartments and begin to touch each other. It's not that time disappears, but it loses authority over consciousness. Jesus did not wait for the miracle, because waiting only exists for those who are outside the state of union with the Father. Within this alignment, reality is already resolved at the level of the cause, even if the senses have not yet reached the effect. That is why spiritual power manifests itself naturally, without tension, without effort, without anxiety. The collapse of time is not something mystical in the fantasy sense, it is a direct consequence of consciousness beyond the ego, where the mind stops negotiating with the future and begins to rest in presence. In this state, prayer as an alignment makes perfect sense, because you don't speak to change something that will come, you recognize something that already is. And when consciousness positions itself like this, the external world inevitably adjusts. This is one of the most difficult points to teach, because it requires practice, not belief. But when you start to experience small moments of this alignment, you realize that time stops being an enemy and becomes just a scenario where the invisible becomes visible. When Jesus talks about entering the inner room, he is not hinting at spiritual organization or suggesting a quiet physical place. He is pointing to a real space of consciousness, an internal place where the common identity, the noise of the mind, and the pressure of the external world are outside. The inner room is that intimate point where the presence of God within is not thought, but felt. It is not imagination, it is not visualization, it is direct perception. That's where inner prayer really happens, because that's where separation begins to dissolve. The problem is that we have been taught to treat this instruction as a poetic metaphor, when in fact it describes a concrete spiritual practice. Entering the inner room means moving attention beyond the ego, beyond the personal narrative, beyond the need for control. It is in this space that Christ consciousness clearly manifests itself, not as a religious concept, but as a lived state. Jesus accessed this place before acting because he knew that spiritual power does not respond to external agitation, but to internal coherence. When you begin to recognize this space within yourself, you realize that it has always been available, just ignored. And the more you return to that inner room, the more natural it feels to be in the right place, even before any visible response appears. Entering the inner room is not enough if the door remains open, and that is exactly where most people get lost. Closing the inner door does not mean escaping the world, but temporarily suspending the influence of mental noise, worries, requests, and expectations. Jesus did not take the noise of the crowd into prayer. He interrupted this flow from within. Silencing the mind is not forcing thoughts to disappear, it is removing attention from them, like turning off a radio that has been playing in the background for years. At first this feels strange, even uncomfortable, because the ego feeds on constant movement. But as spiritual silence sets in, something deeper begins to reveal itself. The presence of God within does not scream, does not demand, does not pressure, it manifests itself in stillness. This is why Jesus' spiritual technique always begins with this simple and radical internal gesture: stopping. When the door closes, prayer stops being speech and becomes a state. And it is in this state that spiritual alignment happens naturally, effortlessly. With the mind stilled, consciousness beyond the ego takes center, and spiritual power finds space to flow. This practice does not require talent, nor special vocation, just constancy. The more times you close this inner door, the faster you recognize the way back. And little by little, silence stops being absence and becomes home. When Christianity stopped being a path lived in small communities and started to become an institution, something essential began to be lost in the process. It was not the words of Jesus, nor the reports of the miracles, but the direct transmission of the spiritual method that underpinned it all. Institutions need replicable forms, standardized rituals, practices that can be taught en masse without requiring inner maturity. And Jesus' method doesn't work like that. It depends on silence, refined attention, constant practice, and a consciousness willing to go beyond the ego. Over time, interior prayer was replaced by external liturgies. Spiritual alignment became doctrine, and the presence of God within began to be mediated by structures, positions, and rules. None of this happened all at once. It was gradual, almost imperceptible. The result is that millions of people began to practice a spirituality that was not institutionalized on the inside, but institutionalized on the outside, repeating forms without accessing the source of spiritual power. And maybe you felt that at some point, that feeling that there's something true there, but it's not being fully delivered. If this part of the story made sense to you, leave a comment here saying if you have ever felt this gap between faith and practice, and subscribe to the channel, because understanding this is just the beginning of what still needs to be remembered. Over time, what survived most strongly were the rituals, not the inner instruction that gave them meaning. People continued praying, kneeling, repeating sacred words, participating in ceremonies, but almost no one was guided to enter the inner space where it all came to life. The original spiritual practice became an external gesture, while the internal movement was forgotten. The problem is not with the rituals themselves, but with the fact that they have been disconnected from direct experience. Without spiritual silence and inner alignment, ritual becomes habit, and habit becomes automatism. Jesus never criticized tradition for existing. He showed that without presence it loses its power. When inner instruction is lost, faith becomes dependent on external rules and validations, and not on the living experience of the presence of God within. This is why so many people do everything they are taught and still feel like something doesn't fit. The internal axle is missing. The return to the inner room remains. The experience that transforms the gesture into a channel is missing. When you understand this, you begin to realize that Jesus' invitation was never to abandon practices, but to inhabit them from the inside out. And until this instruction is resumed, the rituals continue to exist, but the spiritual power remains dormant. Silence has always been the forgotten portal of Christian mysticism, not because it is difficult to reach, but because it dismantles everything the ego uses to feel in control. While the mind wants to explain, ask, argue, and repeat formulas, silence invites you to stop, let go, and cross the threshold where prayer stops being speech and becomes a state. Jesus understood this deeply. He did not treat silence as an optional preparation, but as the very path to spiritual power. Before any miracle, there was recollection, there was pause, there was a conscious return to the inner space where the presence of God within did not need to be invoked, because it was already there. This silence was not empty, it was saturated with presence, a living silence that reorganized consciousness from within. It is at this point that inner prayer really begins to work, because the noise of the ego loses power and the consciousness beyond the ego takes over the center of the experience. When this happens, spiritual alignment stops being an effort and becomes a natural consequence. Silence creates internal coherence, and coherence is what allows power to flow without resistance. Therefore, the silence before the miracle was not theatrical, nor symbolic, it was technical. It was the fine-tuning that allowed the external action to be born from a stable source. And the more someone practices this silence in their daily lives, the less dependent they become on words, rituals, or external validation. Silence becomes language, becomes prayer, becomes communion. It is in this space that faith stops being hope and becomes a lived method, where presence replaces request and spiritual power finds its way to manifest itself naturally. When Jesus prayed, he was not trying to convince God to act, because there was no distance to overcome. Prayer, in the deepest sense, was not a request thrown to heaven, but a conscious return to the state of union with the Father. That is why talking about coherence makes more sense than talking about supplication. Coherence is when what you feel, think, and are inside is aligned with the source of life. In this state, there is no internal contradiction, there is no division between human and divine. Prayer as alignment is born exactly there. While the request starts from the feeling of separation, me here, God there, the union dissolves this boundary. Jesus did not pray for something to change outside. He placed himself in the place where the Father's will was already alive in him. And when there is union, the word stops being an attempt and becomes an expression. This is why prayer without asking is not spiritual coldness, it is inner maturity. It arises when the Christ consciousness establishes itself as the center and the ego loses control. At this point, prayer does not try to create something new, it recognizes what is already aligned in the invisible. The request gives way to agreement, hope gives way to silent certainty, and faith stops being an expectation and becomes a method. This change is subtle but profound, because it completely transforms the relationship with God. Instead of talking to someone far away, you start to speak from the presence of God within. And when that happens, the prayer doesn't have to be long, beautiful, or emotional. It needs to be true, coherent, and rooted in unity. This is the point where spiritual power responds, not because it was asked, but because it found a compatible internal space to manifest. None of what we're talking about works as a shortcut or instant technique, and perhaps that's the hardest part to accept. The spiritual practice that Jesus lived was not something that was activated under pressure or momentary curiosity, but a path of gradual initiation, made up of constant returns to the inner room. He didn't teach this as a formula because it's not something you do, it's something you live by. Consciousness needs to be educated little by little to recognize silence, to remain in the presence, to overcome the initial discomfort of doing nothing. In the beginning, the mind resists, it wants quick results, it wants signs, it wants proof. But true practice happens when you keep going even when it seems like nothing is happening. It is in this nothing that the alignment deepens. Jesus knew that spiritual power is not born from haste, but from constancy, which is why his path was not spectacular on the outside, but extremely rigorous on the inside. Initiation happens when you stop treating prayer as an event and start living it as a state. Few are willing to do this, and that's okay. This path was never for crowds. It is silent, repetitive, sometimes invisible. But that's precisely why it transforms. With each return to silence, with each closing of the inner door, something reorganizes in consciousness beyond the ego. And over time, effortlessly, you realize that you are no longer trying to access God, because the presence has become familiar. This is the invitation that remains open to this day, not to believe more, but to practice better, not to repeat words, but to become space. This is how prayer stops being something you do and becomes the place where you live. Now that you've come this far, it's impossible to pretend you didn't notice. Something has changed in the way you see prayer, even if you still don't know how to explain it in words. It is no longer comfortable to think of it just as a request, as a speech, or as a religious habit. There is a healthy discomfort arising, that feeling that perhaps you have spent years talking too much and not entering enough. And that's not your fault. You did exactly what you were taught. The difference is that now you have been exposed to something deeper, something that cannot simply be forgotten. The question is not whether this is true, but whether you are willing to practice silence enough to find out for yourself. Because this path is not proven with arguments, it is proven with experience. Perhaps you will realize, starting today, that the most important moment in prayer is not when you start speaking, but when you decide to stop. When you close the inner door, you slow down your mind and stay there, even if you don't feel anything at first. And it will test you. It will test your patience, your anxiety for results, your need for control. But it is exactly at this point that something begins to reorganize itself inside. Prayer stops being an event and begins to become a state. You begin to realize that you don't need to arrive at God, because you have never been separated. The inner kingdom of God is not accessed through effort, but through recognition. And recognition only happens when there is enough silence to notice. If you take this seriously, something curious will happen. You will notice that your words decrease, but your presence increases. May your prayers become shorter, but more true. That your faith stops being distant hope and begins to look like internal coherence. And little by little, without fanfare, without spectacle, your life begins to align itself from the inside out. Not because you asked for better, but because you came into existence from a different place. This is the point where prayer stops being something you do for God and becomes the space where God acts through you, as Jesus taught, not with speeches, but with practice. So now I ask you, in all honesty, are you willing to try this, even if there is no applause, even if no one sees it, even if it seems too simple to be powerful? Are you willing to return to the inner room every day, even when the mind says it's not working? If the answer is yes, this path does not end here. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and walk with us, because the next content is not for those looking for quick answers, but for those who are ready to remember what was hidden, but never stopped being available. This is not an invitation to believe more. It is an invitation to practice better.